In tonight's episode of Remote Cabin Radio, we delve into one of Alaska's most chilling legends, a tale shrouded in mystery and terror. The story takes us back to around 1750, when a devastating landslide buried an entire Tlingit Indian village deep in the wilderness of Thomas Bay, claiming the lives of 500 souls. But the story doesn't end there. Fast forward 150 years, when a group of miners ventured into this forsaken land, only to encounter something far more terrifying than the harsh Alaskan wilderness. They came face to face with creatures so horrific they could only be described as devil creatures. This tale of terror is a chilling account of survival, the supernatural, and the mysteries that still haunt the dark corners of the Alaskan wilderness. The spring of 1900 found four men living together in a shack in Wrangell, Alaska. Like many prospectors, we were all broke. As fate would have it, I was one of those four men. For reasons that will become clear, I'll refer to the other three as John, Charlie, and Fred. One evening in April, Charlie burst into our shack, visibly excited. "Fellows," he exclaimed, "I've been trailing an old Indian for the past month, trying to get him to reveal where he found a piece of free gold quartz. I didn't mention it earlier because I wanted the whole story from him first. Today, he finally spilled the beans. He told me to go up to Thomas Bay, camp on Patterson River's right side, travel upriver for about 8 miles, then head to the high mountains. After about 1.5 miles, I'd find a lake shaped like a half-moon. Plenty of stone like I found on the slide there," he said. Now, a prospector will jump at even a whisper of gold, and we were no exception. After some discussion, we decided to gather supplies for Charlie to scout out the prospect. While he was gone, John, Fred, and I would find work to fund another grubstake and pay off the current one. In early May, Charlie loaded his outfit into a canoe and set off from Wrangell for Thomas Bay, which lies about 50 miles to the northwest. He had enough supplies for 3 months, but was to return sooner if he found anything. If he didn't show up within that time, we planned to search for him. John and Fred secured a contract to cut wood, while I took a job at the Wrangell sawmill. Everything went smoothly until early June, when, on a Sunday afternoon, Charlie returned without a coat or hat and looking as if he had been through hell. He didn't greet us, just tossed a piece of quartz into a corner and said, "Get me something to eat. I'm all in and need to rest." The poor fellow certainly looked exhausted, and after eating, he went straight to bed without a word about his trip. We inspected the piece of quartz he had thrown down. For prospectors, it was a beautiful sight, speckled with gold like a freckle-faced child. We were all quite excited, as you can imagine. That evening, we went down to the beach to bring up Charlie's outfit, as he had arrived with only the quartz in hand. But there wasn't anything in the canoe except the oars. We barely slept that night, but Charlie didn't stir once. It was a struggle to get him up for breakfast the next morning. When he finally did get up, he ate, borrowed a coat and hat, and left the house without answering a single question we threw at him. We were all too excited to work that day, so we sat around the shack, passing the quartz between us, eagerly awaiting Charlie's report. In the afternoon, he finally returned and said, "Fellows, the SS Drigo will be heading south early tomorrow. Can you lend me enough money for a ticket to Seattle? I'm through with Alaska and never want to see it again. I'll tell you about my trip to Thomas Bay and where I found that quartz, but my advice is to forget about it. It will only bring you mental and physical pain. If we weren't partners, I wouldn't say a word about this trip, but if you promise never to mention my name in connection with what I'm about to tell you, I'll give you the full story. Judge for yourselves whether I'm sane. This is the most astounding thing you've ever heard, and it's beyond my reasoning. Don't ask any questions to prolong the story. I just want to leave Alaska and forget it if I can. I'll try to make it as plain as possible. Charlie's story. The first night after leaving Wrangell, I camped in Ideal Cove. The next night, I reached Muddy River and set up camp again. By the third night, I was on Ruth Island in Thomas Bay. The following day, I explored Patterson River, looking for a good campsite. I found one about a quarter-mile from Tidewater on the right side, looking up the river. The next day, I moved my camp to this spot, set up my tent, unpacked my outfit, and left the canoe on the riverbank. I spent the following day cooking beans, cutting wood, and making the camp comfortable for a long stay. It started to rain that night and kept up for days. I lost track of time as each day blurred into the next. With nothing to read and nothing to do without getting soaked, I spent most of my time trying to sleep. The constant roar of the river and the wind through the timber was driving me mad. Finally, the weather broke and I got out. I spent several days trying to find the old Indians' half-moon lake, but couldn't locate it. I did find a lake about 2 miles from camp, shaped like the letter S. On the creek flowing from the lower end, I panned some decent colors, not enough to get excited about, but an indication of gold in the area. Talk about a dead country. There's no life there at all. You could spend all day in the timber without seeing a squirrel. Tired of beans, rice, and bacon, I decided to head to a ridge about 8 miles from camp and 2 miles east of the S Lake to hunt for grouse. I had heard a few hooters up there when I was at the head of the lake. I left early the next morning, which was a fine sunny day. I only took my rifle with me, and when I reached the ridge, sure enough, there were a few grouse hooting. I shot 2 and bagged another, which fell down the ridge about 100 yards before getting caught up. On my way down to retrieve it, I found that piece of quartz. Up until then, I hadn't paid much attention to the landscape since it was so heavily timbered and brushy. The formation didn't show, and I didn't have tools to uncover it. The top of an old snag had broken off, scraping the moss and loose dirt for about 8 feet wide and 18 or 20 feet long, exposing this quartz ledge. That's where I found the piece. This ledge had been worked smooth by a glacier at some point. I didn't have anything to break off a piece with, so I used the butt of my gun to get that sample, breaking the stock in the process. That didn't worry me much, as I knew there wasn't any game in that country larger than a grouse, and even those were few and far between. My first thought was of the richness of the quartz, and how I had to get back to town to round you all up so we could get to work on it. After looking it over and feeling satisfied that I had made a rich find, I covered the ledge back up with moss, limbs, and rotten chunks. After finishing that job, I decided to climb the ridge directly over the ledge to get my landmarks so I could find it again, or tell you where it was if anything happened to me. I climbed straight up over the ledge on the ridge until I reached the top, about 600 feet above where I found the ledge. From there, I could see a big tree with a bushy top, taller than the rest, about 50 feet to the right of the ledge. Looking over the top of this tree, I could see out to Frederick Sound, Cape of the Straight Light, Vanderput Spit, and turning slightly to the left, I could see Sukhoi Islands and the mouth of Wrangell Narrows. Satisfied with my landmarks, I turned around to get a view of some mountain peaks. That's when I saw the half-moon lake the Indian had told me about, lying below me on the other side of the ridge from the ledge. Right there, fellows, I got the scare of my life. I pray to God I never experience anything like it again. Swarming up the ridge toward me from the lake were the most hideous creatures. I can't call them anything but devils. They were neither men nor monkeys, yet looked like both. They were entirely sexless, their bodies covered with long, coarse hair, except where scabs and running sores had replaced it. Each one seemed to be reaching out for me, striving to be the first to get me. The air was filled with their cries, and the stench from their sores and bodies made me faint. I forgot my broken gun and tried to use it on the first ones, then threw it at them and ran. God, how I ran! I could feel their hot breath on my back, their long, claw-like fingers scraping my skin. The smell from their steaming, stinking bodies was nauseating, and the noises they made, yelling, screaming, breathing, drove me mad. Reason left me. How I reached the canoe, or how I held on to that piece of quartz, is a mystery. When I came to, it was night, and I was lying in the bottom of my canoe, drifting between Thomas Bay and Sukhoi Island, cold, hungry, and desperate for a drink of water. But only to quench that thirst did I start for Wrangell, and here I am. You probably think I'm crazy or lying, but there's the quartz. Never let me hear the name of Thomas Bay again, and for God's sake, help me get away on that boat tomorrow. And with that, Charlie left our lives. We dismissed his story as a fantasy caused by loneliness, and morbid thought might explain some of the experiences that followed. John and Fred were the next ones to venture out. They left in late July of the same year. I stayed behind at the sawmill, determined to save up some cash for the winter, should nothing else come our way. They took the outfit with them, hoping that if they found the ledge, they could extract as much rock as possible and bring it into town. Fred took the canoe and John took the sailing boat. They were gone only 3 weeks before returning. Fred's boat was empty, and John had brought back only about a quarter of their gear. Neither of them had much to say about the trip, except that they hadn't found the ledge. Fred borrowed some money from me and left for the States at the beginning of September. Just before he departed, he and I were alone in the shack, and he told me this about Thomas Bay. "Harry, I believe the gold is there, just as Charlie said. I also believe he didn't lie about what he saw, because I had one of those devils sitting on the bow of the canoe from Thomas Bay to Horn Cliffs, cursing me every time I tried to rest. My advice to you is the same as Charlie's. Forget it. Even if you do find it, it won't do you any good for years. As for Thomas Bay and what it holds, I hope and pray I never hear of the place again, let alone see it." Fred left and has never returned. I hear from him occasionally, but never a word about his return. After Fred left, John shared his story, saying he didn't feel like mentioning it while Fred was there. John said it took them 3 days to reach Thomas Bay and another day to find Charlie's camp. Everything was just as Charlie had left it, but was damp and moldy. They set up camp near Charlie's and salvaged what they could from his gear. They enjoyed about 6 days of good weather before finding only the lake Charlie had mentioned. Then it began to rain, and they spent a couple of days in camp. Growing impatient during the 3rd day of rain, they decided to split up. John planned to climb a mountain about 7 miles from camp and 2,500 feet high. After breakfast, they each took their chosen route. John reached the top of the mountain and saw the landmarks Charlie had described. Below him, and slightly to his right, he spotted the Half Moon Lake. On the coast side of it was a ridge about 600 to 700 feet high, with several ridges and hills of similar appearance. To the left of this hilly terrain was the S Lake, and Fred was searching the hilly area for the Half Moon Lake. On the side of the lake near John was a large tundra flat with scattered, small jack pine trees. As it was still raining and John was getting cold, he headed towards camp via the lower end of the Half Moon Lake. About halfway down the mountain, he heard 3 shots in quick succession. Curious as there was no significant game to shoot at, he hurried to the tundra flat. There, in the middle of the flat, was Fred, on his hands and knees, attempting to pull up a small jack pine with his teeth and making noises like a barking dog. John watched for about 20 minutes before Fred crawled to the edge of the timber, broke a limb from a small tree, and started making shavings. John approached and spoke, but received no answer. He called Fred's name, still no response. Finally, he shook Fred and asked what he was doing. Fred looked at him with a distant expression and said, "Is that you, John? Do you have any matches? I'm trying to build a fire, but have no matches, and I'm so cold I can hardly move." John asked if Fred had done the shooting and where his gun was. Fred didn't answer. John returned to the tundra where he first saw Fred. The area was dug up in small holes. Small pine trees were pulled up and scattered around, and Fred's gun was stuck in the tundra up to the hammer. John retrieved the gun and found 1 empty shell in the barrel and 3 loaded shells in the magazine. He went back to Fred, who was still squatting, and said, "Here's your gun. Let's get back to camp. It's getting late." Fred agreed. "All right, John, if you can find camp and help me get there, I'll go. But if you're just trying to scare me like those other devils, you can go to hell. I'll stay here where my fire is and where it's warm." John assured him there was no fire, that he was wet, cold, and sick, and urged Fred to follow him quickly. They made their way back to camp, with Fred increasingly speeding up as they moved away from the lake until both were running. They reached camp about dark. Fred rolled into the blankets, and John started a fire and made supper. After a silent meal, Fred went outside and yelled to John, "John, the devils are coming. Let's get in the boats and go to Wrangle. Whoopee!" He grabbed his gun and took off. John thought he heard padded feet and, scared, grabbed a few blankets, some food, and the gun. He quickly packed up and paddled away from the camp. The darkness and rain made it difficult, but the wind was calm. John heard Fred's whoopee and kept paddling towards it. As dawn approached, they were near Horn Cliff. Fred was about half a mile ahead. John stopped rowing, took up the gun, and fired a shot to get Fred's attention. Fred stopped paddling, grabbed his gun, fired 3 shots, and then stood up in the canoe, yelling and waving his paddle. John feared Fred was about to jump overboard, so he paddled furiously to reach him. When he caught up, Fred was laughing and said, "Got one of them anyway. Did you see him go overboard when I shot? He was sitting on the bow of the canoe, cursing me all night. As soon as it was light enough, I shot him. We're okay now, John. Thank God we got out alive." John asked about Fred's gun, wanting to secure it in his own boat for safety. Fred admitted he had thrown it overboard because it had no more shells. John believed this splash was what he saw after hearing the 3 shots. "We stopped at McDonald Island," John continued, "and cooked breakfast and had a good rest. After that, Fred was normal but very quiet about what happened. He was eager to reach Wrangle, and you know the rest." I asked John, "What do you think of that country, and when are we going up there? I want to go, whether I find gold or not. I want to see if I'll go crazy like the others or see some of these devils if they exist." John said, "Harry, I don't like that place. Charlie and Fred were strong and clear-headed. Why would they act like this? It's too late to go this year because the rainy season has started. Let's postpone it until next year." "But John, what about the outfit? There are tools, blankets, cooking gear and powder up there. We can't afford to lose that much." John suggested, "Let's take the sailing boat, make a quick trip up there, hide the tools and perishable items, and bring back the tent and other essentials." We did this, and I got my first glimpse of Thomas Bay on September 2nd, 1900. It was a beautiful, sunny day. The bay looked like a large lake, and the high, snow-capped mountains reflected their beauty in the smooth water. But it all seemed so lonesome and quiet. I felt as if we were the only living things in that vast expanse of water and land. We found the camp and outfit in surprisingly good shape, considering the hurried treatment it had received. We spent the night there and the next day stored what we could of the outfit under a large windfall. John pointed out the mountain he had climbed and the approximate locations of the Half Moon Lake and S Lake. As clouds began to gather, we left and camped in Brown's Cove that night. We had to stay there for 7 days due to bad weather. When the weather improved, we broke camp and reached Wrangell by late evening on the same day. John went to Nome the following spring, and I went up the Stykeene River. 2 years passed before we saw each other again. In the summer of 1903, we made a trip to our old camp to retrieve the tools we had stored. We hiked to find the lake, but couldn't find any trace of it. The next day, we tried again and failed. The country looked so similar, with so many small ridges, valleys, and bluffs, that we became confused and wasted the whole day trying to get somewhere. I tried using a compass, but it seemed unreliable. I studied the terrain and found it contained large deposits of magnetic iron. With 6 to 8 miles to walk from our camp, we decided to set up near S Lake, although John was not very keen on moving so close to this uncertain area. By the second day in the new locality, we located the Half Moon Lake around noon. John and I walked around the lake and took a fair assessment. As we circled the ridge, we discovered that the exposed formation was a highly mineralized skirt. I took out my compass, and it swung towards the hill, indicating magnetic iron. I noted that John seemed anxious to leave for some reason, and I didn't feel very comfortable myself. It was as if something with a menacing presence was always behind me, with hundreds of angry eyes watching. I felt a sense of danger, but tried to keep my focus on the task at hand. Still, I couldn't help but glance around frequently. John said, "Harry, do you feel the same way I do?" I replied, "I don't know, John, but I feel damned odd, as if something or somebody was about to pounce on me." "That's exactly how I feel," he said. "I've seen the bushes moving in several places, both behind and below us, but I can't spot anything making them move." "Look, John," I said, "this is all nonsense. What could possibly be in this wilderness? I'm not afraid of anything I can see or fight, but when you feel surrounded by an unseen force that means you no good, it's time to leave. And by God, I am going." So we packed up and made camp at around 5 p.m. That night, John woke me by nudging me and whispering, "Harry, wake up. Do you hear that? Wake up, listen. Can't you hear anything?" Coming out of a sound sleep, knowing what I did about that country and having someone whispering was enough to make anyone's nerves tingle. Slowly, through my sleep-addled senses, I heard a strange sound, half squeak and half moan, which seemed very close. The noise of small branches or chips breaking could also be heard. I was terrified. Every hair on my body stood on end, and cold shivers ran down my spine. I sat up, grabbed my gun, and chambered a shell while I listened. Gradually, my senses returned, and after ejecting the loaded shell, I put the gun down and flopped back into bed, saying, "John, you damned fool, after all your time in the woods, can't you recognize a porcupine's song while it eats?" "Porcupine, hell," John replied. "There aren't any around here. You know we haven't seen any in this country." There was no more sleep for him that night, and as soon as morning came, we broke camp and headed back to Wrangell. So ended that chapter of the story. John is still in Alaska. We often get together for trips, but he will never return to Thomas Bay. For the next 3 years, I traveled around different parts of Alaska, but always intended to make one more trip to the Devil's Country, as I called the district. I lacked the nerve to go alone, and whenever I told interested parties the story, they always backed out. One night in Petersburg, a new town, in 1906, I visited a saloon recently opened by a man from the States. During the evening, after several drinks, the saloon keeper and I became quite friendly. I told him I was a prospector who had explored southeastern Alaska. He told me about a dream he had before he ever thought of coming to Alaska. His dream was as follows. I took a ride in a boat and arrived at a large bay. At the head of the bay was a big river, which I followed until I reached a glacier. Then I walked to my right, around the base of a mountain and into a country broken up with small ridges and little canyons. I got lost in my dream. I wandered for a long time, finally finding a lake shaped like the last quarter of the moon. On one side of the lake was a big flat, and on the other side was a bluffy ridge, which I followed down to the lake until I reached the outlet. I followed the outlet until I came to another lake, which looked like it could make the last quarter moon shape on one side and the first quarter moon shape on the other. I was standing there, contemplating its peculiar shape, when I woke up. I found this dream amusing, as it closely resembled the Devil's Country. So I said, "I know where that place is, Mr. Bush." "You do?" he asked. "Well, show me that place, and I will show you $1 million. We agreed to go as soon as he could find someone to manage his place. Mr. Bush and I left one evening in July on a motorboat he had chartered for the trip. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast, we went ashore in the dinghy. He carried a rifle, and I carried a gold pan, prospecting pick, and lunch. Mr. Bush was a large man, nearly 200 pounds, but he was short-legged, making travel slow. The day was warm and sultry, with no wind. We were nearly there, and while rounding a bluffy point on one of the ridges, he looked at the bluff and said, "Culp, I've seen that bluff before. Just over the next ridge ahead of us is where the lake lies." "Yes," I said. "You're right, Mr. Bush. If I'm not mistaken, that's the last hill we need to climb. Let's get going," he said. "I'm anxious to see if that lake is really there, and if it looks like it did in my dream. If so, our troubles are over, and we'll have plenty to see us through the rest of our lives." We started up the hill, which was about 500 or 600 feet high. I was leading and setting the pace. Halfway up, I heard a noise behind me and turned just in time to see Mr. Bush roll down the hill a short distance, crash into an old log, and lie still. When I reached him, he was on his back, with his eyes open, but rolled back, showing only the whites. I was in quite a predicament if something was wrong with him. 7 miles from the beach, alone, and with a 200-pound man to extract from the timber was no easy task. He wore a felt hat, so I picked it up along with his gun, which lay a short distance from him, and went down to a little creek below us. I filled his hat with water, climbed back, and poured it over his head, face, and chest. I then raised his head and shoulders, propping them against the log. I was just about to fetch another hatful of water when he rolled his eyes back, and a bewildered look came into them. I asked, "What the hell is the matter? Are you going to croak?" "Is that you, Colp?" he asked weakly. "Take me out of here, will you?" "Sure I will," I said. "But you'll have to walk. The streetcars aren't running and you're too heavy for me to carry." I broke open the lunch and told him to eat a bit. Then we would start back if he wanted to. He ate a little and then got to his feet. I did the same, handed him his gun, and we began to head out. When we reached the little creek, he stopped and began calling me everything he could think of. He accused me of taking him up into the hills to kill him, etc. I reached over, took the gun from him, unloaded it, and put the shells in my pocket. He didn't say a word about that, or even try to hang on to the gun. When I handed it back after unloading it, he accepted it meekly. I started down the creek, and he followed for a bit before starting up again. This time I was angry and sighed, "Look here, do you see that creek?" "Yes," he replied. "Do you see which way it is running?" "Yes." "Well," I said, "that creek is running out to the beach where our boat is, isn't it?" "No, by God it isn't," he shouted. "It's running uphill, and you're taking me back inland to kill me. We argued all the way back to the beach. I never want to experience anything like that again. He got into the dinghy, and we rowed out to the motorboat. Once on the boat, he lay down immediately. I hauled up the anchor, started the engine, and headed for Petersburg. It was a calm, clear night. When we were nearly in town, Mr. Bush got up and asked where we were in a natural tone of voice. I told him we were just at the mouth of the Narrows and then asked him what he meant by his actions and abuse that day. I wanted an explanation. "Colp," he said, "don't ask me, I'll only lie to you. One thing is certain, I hope I never have to go into that bay again." 2 more years passed before I had another chance to go up there. In August 1908, I left Petersburg in a small motorboat with supplies for a long stay. I was going into that country alone this time. It took all my courage to force myself to go, but I felt I had to see for myself, whether it was gold, devils, or insanity. Arriving in Thomas Bay, I anchored, took the dinghy, and rowed around looking for a suitable place to put the motorboat on the beach at high tide. I found a nice little cove with a good, level beach. Set just back in the woods a bit, I noticed there was a tent. I yelled, but no one showed up, so I went up to it and found the flaps tied. I opened them up and went in, because I wanted to see if I could find a name or anything to indicate whose camp it was, and if I knew the party. As soon as I stepped into the tent, I could see that no one had lived in it for quite a while. The blankets were thrown back, as if someone had just gotten up, but they were damp and moldy, as was the foodstuff. A slab of bacon hung by a string from the ridgepole, and it was also moldy. Nearly a full sack of flour stood in the corner. The mice had eaten into that, and it too was moldy. A pair of size 10 shoes was covered with mold, as were the used dishes and cooking utensils. A .30 caliber US rifle was pretty badly ruined. Some clothes hung over a line in the tent were moldy. Outside the tent, an axe stood by a tree, but there were no tracks of any kind around the tent or on the beach, showing that no one had been there since the last rain, at least, and that was about 3 weeks past. I figured by the looks of the tent and the stuff in it that no one had been there for at least 6 weeks or 2 months. I could find no letters or reading matter with the party's name on it. The only thing around was a tide table with the month of June marked off up to the 14th. The bed and camp indicated that the owner was only one man, and he was probably a white man. Pulled into the edge of the timber and covered over with pieces of bark to keep the sun from it was a double-ended, round-bottomed boat about 16 feet long and painted at one time a dark green. I fastened the tent flaps again just as I had found them and rowed back to the motorboat to think the matter over. Finally, I decided that the best thing for me to do was to go back to town and report the case, as it was quite evident that the man was lost somewhere in the hills. The tent showed that he hadn't intended to stay away long, or he would have covered up his stuff to keep the mice out at least. Ibers idbak tokon ang investigake the situation. No track o the missing man was found. Ang al-shak was dong by the authorities was kolevi a signi nope in she kengskashi shat. The owner was to report to the marshal's office in Petersburg as soon as possible. The party never showed up. Another unsolved mystery. Running into that deserted camp and the disappearance of the lone man in that section of the country wiped out all idea of my going in there alone. Another 3 years rolled by before I made the next and last trip into the Devil's Country. In 1911, I told this story to a big, husky Norwegian, and at the finish, he was all set to go. I had a log cabin in Brown's Cove where I was living at that time, and by walking overland 18 miles, we could camp on the Half Moon Lake. We fixed packs for each of us of about 60 pounds. We arrived on the right side of the lake at about 3 p.m., having made good time. We picked out a place to camp at the foot of the lake, where we set up our tent. Everything fixed up for the night, we turned in. What passed through Ole's mind, if anything, I don't know. I think he was tired, and I know I was. Everything about this place came to me there in bed. I thought of the devils and of Charlie, of Fred barking like a dog on this same flat we were camped on, of John and the porcupine, of Mr. Bush, and of that unknown man whose camp I had found. My nerves were strung to the breaking point. Fear had me in its grip. Finally, my overstrained muscles relaxed, and I fell asleep. I awoke in the morning feeling fine bodily, but with that old dread of the place upon me and that everlasting inner voice bidding me to leave before something happened. I cooked breakfast, mixed up a flapjack in the gold pan, and when the coffee was on, I yelled at Ole to get up and come to eat. He had gone down to the lake to wash, and when he came back, I asked him how he had slept, but he never said a word, not even good morning. Thinking that he was one of those fellows who didn't feel like talking before breakfast, I said no more. This was my first time out with Ole, so I was not used to his peculiarities. After breakfast, I turned to Ole and said, "Well, Ole, what will we do today? Take the gold pan and prospect for colors, or shall we take the pick and shovel and see what we can find out about the formation around here?" He just looked at me for a short while, took the pipe out of his mouth, and said, "Well, Harry, I think we better go out again. I don't feel so good." Knowing what I did about the place, I said, "Out we go," and we broke camp right away. I took him back to Petersburg. Often have I asked him why he didn't want to stay, and he tells me that we spent 2 weeks there and prospected the country around the lake and all the ridges and found nothing. Maybe we did, but if so, I am the one who was out of my mind because I can't remember a thing about it. In 1914, I sent 2 men there, telling them nothing about the place other than the whereabouts I wanted them to prospect. One was half Russian, and the other was Japanese. They made the trip in all right and found the lake. They camped near it. One of the men used a shovel turned over with the round side up for a pillow, while the other used a gold pan. In the morning, the shovel had disappeared, and during the day, one of the men fell over a small cliff and hurt himself quite badly, so they had to come back to Petersburg, saying that they'd had enough of the place. In 1919, I sent 3 other men there to prospect. They came back in a couple of weeks. One told me they had never gone to Thomas Bay. One said they were in Thomas Bay, but hadn't gone to the section to which I'd sent them. The third man told me they found everything as I described it, and had done lots of prospecting, but couldn't raise a color. Now, who told the truth? Another strange tale was told to me by a reliable person, one who would have no object in lying. This party had a dairy farm on Muddy River, about 16 miles from the Devil's Country. He said that an old trapper came and camped on the river about 1 mile from his place during the winter of 1925. This trapper ran a trap line up Muddy River as far as he could travel in one day and then pitched camp and ran several shorter lines from that base. Later in the fall, he ran a line into the S Lake. In the meantime, he had found some free-milling quartz on a ridge and had planned to wait until spring before going in to find out how big the ledge was. One day in February, this trapper came to the ranch again and said he had had a very funny thing happen to him. He had been trapping and prospecting all his life, but he had found the most peculiar tracks on the S Lake trap line. He had been setting traps and all kinds of sets to catch the beast, but all he got was snapped sets. He had therefore taken up that trap line. That night it snowed about 6 inches. During the night, he heard his dog bark, and he thought he heard it howl. Once, it seemed to run away, barking as it did. In the morning, no dog was in sight. He thought it seemed funny because the dog had always been around camp in the mornings, no matter how much he roamed around at night. He couldn't have gotten caught in a trap because he was trap-wise. He took the dog's trail and followed it just a little way from the tent when he came to the same strange animal tracks following the dogs. The dogs and the strange tracks were all mixed up for about 500 yards when the dogs' tracks disappeared, and only the strange tracks went on. He stood and studied the tracks, but could make no sense of them. The dog tracks were going along, and there were the strange tracks going right after them. In some places, the mysterious owner of the tracks had stepped into the dog tracks and covered them, showing that it was behind the dog. The dog tracks showed that the dog had been running, but when they ended, there were no signs of a struggle. It looked as if the dog had vanished, or had been picked up clear from the ground right in the midst of its steps. The trapper, after looking the ground over, decided he would follow the strange animal's tracks and see where it had gone. If he could find its den, or where it stayed, he might get a chance to shoot it and see what kind of animal it was. So off he went. The tracks went in a big circle, and after a time came back to where the trapper had taken them up at the place where the dog tracks left off and were following the owner. Twice they went around in this way, and then they led off into the woods in the direction of the ridge with the quartz outcropping. He lost them on the bare ridge, but found them again on the other side. They had gone over the mountain and down the hill to the lake, where he lost them in the rough lava formations. From that day to this, no word has ever come from him. He vanished just as mysteriously as the dog did. All that spring, the rancher expected to hear from him, and then one day, he went to the trapper's camp on Muddy River. He found everything in perfect condition, as the trapper had left it, but there were no signs of the man. The following fall, the government sent a man to the place to investigate the trapper's disappearance. He was a person who had known the trapper for many years and was very much surprised that the trapper should take such an unexplainable and mysterious leave of absence without letting anyone know. There was little this man could do to solve the mystery other than searching the surrounding country for the missing trapper's bones, but as far as I know, they never turned up. A few days later, he followed the trap line back up to the lake to see if he could find anything there that would give him a clue. When he reached the spot on the lake, he made camp there and started searching the country in that vicinity, finally finding the tracks the trapper had described. He followed them over the ridge and to the lake just as the trapper had, but he couldn't find any trace of them on the other side. When he came back to camp, he decided to take a rest for a day or so, but the same peculiar fear or dread came over him that had often taken possession of other people who had gone into the devil's country. He thought the best thing he could do was to get out before anything happened to him. He returned to the ranch on Muddy River and then back to town, saying he had done all he could. He told me of finding the strange tracks and said they were like none he had ever seen before. He had spent many years in the north, trapping in British Columbia and Alaska, yet this track was a new one to him. The beast that made it had, according to his estimate, a 7.6 spread from toe to heel. It must have weighed over 400 pounds, because it had broken the crust of the snow in many places where he himself had not gone through. Even though he carried a heavy pack, there the story ends. Here is the only evidence we have to date, and this evidence amounts to just 3 strange things. First, the sudden and unexplained disappearance of several people, including an old trapper and his dog, in the same area. Second, the peculiar tracks that appear and disappear without a trace, tracks that are unlike anything known to the seasoned woodsmen and trappers who encountered them. Third, the overwhelming sense of dread that seems to pervade the area known as the Devil's Country, a place where men with nerves of steel have felt the icy grip of fear and have chosen to flee rather than face the unknown. All these occurrences remain unexplained, and the mystery of Thomas Bay and its Devil's Country continues to baffle those who hear the tales. What lies within that foreboding wilderness? What creature or force is responsible for these strange happenings? These questions remain unanswered, leaving us only with stories of fear, disappearance, and the strange tracks that seem to lead nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The Devil's Country keeps its secrets well, and those who venture too far into its depths may find themselves part of its dark lore, their stories forever lost to the shadows of the Alaskan wilderness. As the winds of time sweep through the rugged wilderness of Thomas Bay, they carry with them whispers of forgotten camps, vanished men, and unexplainable tracks that defy reason. The stories etched into the soil of the Devil's Country are not merely tales of misfortune and mystery, they are echoes of an ancient, untamed force that lingers just beyond the edge of human understanding. Here, in the heart of the Alaskan wilds, where the mountains stand as silent sentinels and the forests teem with secrets, men have come seeking fortune only to be met with something far more elusive and far more dangerous. What is it about this land that ensnares the mind and haunts the soul? Is it the isolation, the unforgiving terrain, or something more, something that dwells in the shadows, watching, waiting? The trapper's story, with its peculiar tracks and the eerie disappearance of a trusted dog, adds another chapter to the ever-growing legend of Thomas Bay. And while many have tried to unravel the mysteries of this place, few have returned with answers, and fewer still have come back at all. The land remains as enigmatic as ever, a place where reality blurs with myth, and where the natural world and the supernatural seem to coexist in a delicate, dangerous balance. As we leave the tale of Thomas Bay, one cannot help but feel a lingering sense of unease, a question that gnaws at the back of the mind. What truly lurks in the devil's country? Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but merely acknowledged as a reminder of the limits of human knowledge and the vast, untamed forces that lie just beyond our understanding. Here, at Remote Cabin Radio, we delve into these dark corners of history, not to find closure, but to shed light on the unknown, to bring these forgotten stories to life once more. Whether it's the legend of the hairy woman, the haunting of Wendigo, or the chilling encounters in Thomas Bay, we invite you to journey with us into the depths of the strange, the unexplained, and the unknown. Because sometimes the answers are not as important as the questions themselves. This is Remote Cabin Radio, where history and mystery collide, and where every story leaves you wondering what else might be out there, waiting in the dark. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your mind sharp, and remember, not everything that is lost stays buried. Some things linger, watching and waiting to be found.